Welcome to the Shared Practices podcast. We have an episode today where we're going to be talking about some controversial stuff and some things that people tend to care about, which is building wealth in a dental practice and what that looks like, what's possible. This creates for a lot of our listeners hope, excitement, like it changes what they realize is possible and the direction they're going and how fast they get there. So these are the high level conversations that I think are some of the most impactful to have. They're also the most likely to cause like FOMO, skepticism, like, I don't know if that's possible, or opting out in people's minds of I can't do that. So George, you're here to stretch our minds as to what's possible. Welcome back.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Richard. And I think, one of the things that has changed a lot about dentistry since we've started the Shared Practices podcast is the emergence of the DSO landscape. And so I almost feel like this is, almost all the different seasons of the original podcast with taking in mind the modern industry that we're in, right? We're in an industry where DSOs are a big part of it and private practice is a big part of it. And so I almost want to focus on the wealth that gets accumulated through a dentist's career and looking at the different stages and almost kind of just talk about both. Talk about private practice, talk about DSOs, and help any dentist listening understand where they are at relative to like a whole dentist's career, and how do we think about wealth at different stages of your career, also with different opportunities.
Okay, well, let's talk about this. And so the reason this is always so exciting is like the gains, the potential to start here, to invest this much, whether it's a startup or an acquisition, and turn that into opportunities that you just kind of can't get anywhere else unless you're a really savvy business person in an industry where you've got a competitive advantage, which is rare. So like we have some amazing opportunities for wealth building. How do you think about this? We talk about this to our pre-owners at our courses and open their minds to the possibilities.
Yeah, so I think that the way I think about it is I really think of if I'm a dentist and I'm going to practice for, let's just say 20 years, just to put like a, just some, maybe we could say 30, 40, different timelines for every person. But, I think that when you think about it that way, you think about, okay, there's two forms of wealth or financial value I'm going to get from my career. The first one is my income along the way. And my second one is my wealth that I build, right? Those are the two things that you get financially from being a dentist. And I think that, it's important to distill it down to those simple nature, because then we're going to look at private practice, certain opportunities. We're going to look at a DSO, what they offer, and we're going to help people understand how to think about like the financial ways that I benefit from being a dentist. So I think at a very fundamental level, your income, when you look at it, you're going to have a higher tax rate on it. So that's something that comes from income compared to more wealth gaining through capital gains. But then you're also going to have your living expenses, right? The purpose of your income is for lifestyle and also for savings, right? So when you consider an income, you got to think about it. Okay, what's the purpose of the income? The purpose of the income is to have a nice lifestyle, a dentist lifestyle, we'll call it, and also have the ability to put away money and accumulate savings or investments or whatever it is you want to do with that over time. And the purpose of the wealth building side through your career is to have an egg at the end of the rainbow, so to speak. So like of all these years I've put into being a dentist, showing up to the office consistently, providing, value, what do I have to show for it at the end of whatever time I've been doing that for? And that's really the nest egg in your career, whether that's equity in a practice you own, whether that's equity in a partnership that you have with another dentist, or whether that's, stock in a DSO. Those are the different forms of the same type of thing. It's essentially what's my nest egg at the end of being a dentist for 20 years. And, that's kind of how I think we should really think about it, just very fundamentally, and talk about how that applies to different situations.
Well, and I'm a big fan of building multiple nest eggs. You can translate the income into whatever investments you want outside of dentistry, whether that's index funds in the stock market, which aren't sexy, but they're consistent and they don't require a ton of management fees and they don't require stock picking. You can look at stuff like real estate, and a lot of dentists I know build up a portfolio of single family or multifamily or commercial properties, and that's how they build a separate nest egg from the practice. But the funny thing is, in order to be efficient at doing that, you need a lot of disposable income. You need to kind of exceeded your needs significantly, and then you can really accelerate your investments outside of dentistry. But by building that income in the first practice, you've increased the net worth of that asset so significantly. So it's this ability to kind of break free opens multiple doors of wealth. And there is this dentist lifestyle. And then there's, if you can kind of maintain a lifestyle and then accelerate further, these multiple doors for building wealth open up.
Totally. And I think that what you're saying kind of leads us to the first part of a dentist's career. So like when a dentist graduates from school, one of the first things they should be thinking about is, how do I put myself in a sustainable place where I'm having a high income and building wealth? That's like the first step in a dentist's career, is to find how you want to do that. Because Richard's point's great, right? You're going to be graduating school with student loans, so you have debt. You may want to you're going to want to accumulate wealth throughout your career. And a high income is a very necessary thing to do that. And so you're going to want to have a high income. And where am I going to find a high income where I build wealth, right? Those are that's the first question, right? And people graduate and they start paying off their student loans right away. And it's like, well, you need to do that after you've established that first thing, which is, how do I get the high income? So the first part of your career should be get the income, right? And there's definitely multiple ways you can do that. You can start a practice and be an owner. You could buy a practice and be an owner. You could enter into a partnership where you have a high income, or you could work for a DSO where you have a high income. In any of those areas, you need to put yourself in a position where you are happy with your income throughout your career. And I think that is step one of this process, is putting yourself in a stable place where you are going to build wealth long-term and have a high income along the way.
It's I've known people who take sabbaticals going between undergraduate or between undergraduate and dental school. For me, there was an urgency of let me get through undergraduate as fast as possible.
Yeah.
Let me get into dental school. Let me get out, because what's possible on the other side of that was always top of mind for me. And I think it should be the same thing with growth and acceleration in your career, whether it's investing in yourself that allows you to have a skill set to do advanced procedures or coaching or reinvesting in your practice. The highest ROI is always going to be solving for this first, having an increased income in dentistry and the ability to build wealth on the back end of that. And the sooner you can get there, the better.
And I think that, that's going to differ by person, right? Each person's going to have a different idea of what a high income is, right? So I don't want to sit there and throw out a number and then it's interesting because, I know people who were in private practice for 40 years, and the whole time their income was that of an associate dentist at a busy office. And so I think that I think in the modern dental world, we cannot be so stuck on one path being the best way to do anything anymore. I think that all the rules have broken. And I think that in this podcast, we tend to be focused on private practice. And so in private practice, there's really two ways: start or buy, right? I tend to really like acquisitions. And so, we've heard a previous Ask George where we discussed, the different paths to get into ownership. And so we're not going to spend too much time on the start or buy today, but if you go back to one of the previous Ask George, you'll hear me talk all about that. But it's get into private practice, own my own practice, have a high income through that successful operation, or get in a partnership scenario. So there's actually people who have been emailing me, or I've been hearing from, that they have, like, healthy, like $500,000 a year income at a partnership opportunity. And, it's like, great, that's what that person wants to do. Like, and I think that makes a lot of sense for this right person. And then, a DSO, right? DSOs can offer that same type of thing. And so I think that the first step is get an income that allows you to live the dentist lifestyle, pay your taxes, and have additional funds that can be invested in your choosing, right? So I think Richard was talking about real estate or index funds. And I think that, I think that from my perspective, I really subscribe to the idea that you should be investing in something you know about more than the average person who's investing money, right? So it's like, if you know a lot about real estate, you should invest in real estate. If you know a lot about index funds, then you should invest in index funds. If you know a lot about something else, you should invest in that. So I don't have like a investment advice for anyone with those additional funds that you're putting away, other than focus on your strengths and invest in areas where you're strong, and be careful on the active passive spectrum of investments to make sure you're picking the right one for you. Some people want active investments, some people want passive investments, and just be mindful of if you're doing a passive or active investment. And beyond that, I don't necessarily know that I want to get too deep into the investment advice.
It's funny because I'm the opposite. I'm like, if you want passive, then do index funds. And if you want active, do real estate that you're in control of, and choose a niche that you can double down on and learn and know the market for. Because those are two things that people will lose their shirts on all sorts of weird business deals, on all sorts of weird things they don't have experience in. Or when someone else is in control, like they partner with someone, they're not the active partner, but it's
that's
kind
tough.
of an active investment. So I do have strong takes, and they are index funds and real estate that you can control if you're going to be active.
Well, maybe let's reserve this for a future Ask George.
Sure.
Is to get more
100%.
granular on what to do with your money, right?
Yeah.
But if you think about it, right, we've talked about at the beginning of the episode, we talked about, okay, there's income and there's net worth. I think we've covered the income entirely.
Well, I guess I'll say, you said I'm not going to put a number out there as to like what you think.
Yeah, feel free to.
Like, I think 300K is a breaking point.
I agree.
Below that, like student loans and lifestyle and all of those things and taxes, it all like takes up a lot of it. And it's hard to have a significant chunk to set aside. Beyond 300K, people can inflate their lifestyle and gobble it all up. But you can have the ability to funnel real quantities of money away into other investments. And you can get above 300K as an associate in the right opportunity, as a partner in the right opportunity, as an owner. Like those are very reasonable things to look for yourself. And we see it all the time. We've talked about on the podcast before, $1 million take-home practice. Like, yeah, that's possible. And it's possible in a lot of different ways. It's also not average by any stretch of the imagination. But what is very reasonable, I think, is to clear 300K if you're doing it right and you're willing to pursue the right opportunities.
Yeah, totally. So I think, high income, anywhere between 300 and $1 million. And I think that that's good to leave it like that. We have, we have that entire range of income in our DSO, right? So it's like, you can say that, there's many different ways to skin the income cat. And I think that, when I think about it, I agree with what Richard said. You need to have a sufficient amount to clear your lifestyle requirements and have savings. Like that, I think, is just fundamentally good advice. And that's a different number for every person. Some people have more inflated lifestyles. Some people don't. Some people want to save more. Some people don't, so, to each their own. But then I want to go into the net worth side, because I think this is where it gets really interesting. So, if you are, let's talk about private practice first, because that's like the standard, right? So the standard in dentistry is private practice, and the career arc of somebody. So, you're going to, let's just say you're going to acquire a practice. Then you grow that practice and you pay off your debt. So through the middle of your career, you are going to be accumulating equity in your practice, right? Through the practice growth your practice will be worth more. And from each month that you submit your note payment to the bank, your practice is going to have less debt. So through the early part of your career, I would call it the first 10 years of your private practice ownership, you are likely in a phase of wealth accumulation through equity in the practice. You're not getting it in cash to invest, but you are building yourself wealth through time. You're growing your business, which makes your business worth more, and you're paying down debt, which will make there be less debt on the business, so you have more equity. So in private practice, there's an initial period of what I will call wealth accumulation. And then after that period becomes a second period, which in private practice I would call wealth stagnation. And so I think that this is an important thing to introduce, because let's just say I'm a solo dentist and I'm going to practice by myself with no associate. Once I reach that max that I can do, and I've paid off my debt, let's just say after 10 years, then every single year that I remain in that place, I am not building additional wealth by showing up to my office each day for that year. It is staying the same, and I'm getting an income. So that's like, there's a shift in what happens to a dentist's wealth building in their practice when they go from wealth accumulation through growing their practice and paying down their debt to wealth stagnation, which is you're no longer accumulating value for each year that you go in every day or every working day to provide services. So I think that that's just like two really distinct periods. And it could be 5 years, it could be 10 years, it could be 15. But
Right.
Those are the very real phases that a dentist will go through.
Well, and that stagnation occurs when you hit your capacity and you're unwilling to expand or unable to, depending on the market forces and what's possible. And you've maximized the profitability and the production of your practice. And for our clients, I mean, we've had some really amazing 3-4 year client journeys, and going from, 500, 700,000 to 2, 3, up to $4 million of collections is possible. And that's this exciting road. And that highly leveraged, like you can create wealth in that phase in no other way. And then what? And I think it's this sense of the wealth needle doesn't move as much, the change required, like this steady state. For some people, they love it. But I think for the person who can build this, there's also this risk of like fidgetiness and how do I continue to grow? And that is it's a real thing. And that's where like burnout and stress and the grind of it and the lack of like future anticipating growth can be a problem for people.
So I have a strong curiosity at the moment, like in present day as I'm recording this. I don't have the answer, but I have a question as to we've created a lot of mega group owners from our coaching, right? And a mega group owner is somebody who has a $3 to $5 million practice. I'll give you an example. One individual, they started working with shared practices. They had a $1.2 million 6-operatory practice when they started. They now last year did 5.2, and it was 4 years later. So in 4 years, they went from that initial $1.2 million practice to the $5.2 million practice. And there was another one, you go from like solo to 3 million. We have several of these at this point. And I'm really interested in the question of, you think about the life of somebody who's reached that $3 to $5 million practice. They might have between a 1 to 3 day clinical, schedule. They're going to have passive income through the ownership of that practice that is in the $500 to $1 million range, not including the dentistry they're doing. And they have an asset that is worth between $5 to $8 million. So you think of a mega group owner, they have $5 to $8 million of equity in their practice. They have 1 to 3 days worth of income from doing dentistry, plus $500,000 to $1 million a year of income from ownership of that asset. So like, that's a unique place. If and where I think it's interesting is you've reached the end of wealth accumulation in that office, right? You're most likely not going to be able to double it to 10 million. You can, but I think that you start to get to the place of like, okay, the practice is going to be at this size long term. And, you can keep getting that income and investing it. But like the $5 to $8 million that practice is worth is likely not going to go drastically up compared to the rate of growth that it's had over the last 4 or 5 years. Start to make that transition from wealth accumulation, that accumulation of that $5 to $8 million of equity, to practice wealth stagnation, where it's going to be worth $5 to $8 million whenever you sell it, now, 10 years from now, 20 years from now, and you have the income along the way. And, I'm like really interested in what are these people going to do? Like, I want to talk to them. I would like to ask them, because Suzanne's actually arranging for me some conversations in March where I'm going to be asking people these questions because I just really am interested. And I want to know, like, what are you going to do? And what are you going to do where are you at? Do you want multiple? Do you want to sell? Like, what's interesting? And you think about it, it's not so straightforward an answer, because if you sell, you get the $5 to $8 million, in cash, and you can go invest that and accumulate wealth beyond that. Or you could say, well, it's going to be worth $5 to $8 million no matter what, and I like this income. So then I'm going to take the income and I'm going to invest it and accumulate wealth, knowing that my practice is going to stagnate in its value, but that it's a healthy value and I'll reap the rewards later. And so I don't think there's such a straightforward answer to that question. And I really think the answer starts with the question, is it sustainable long term? And if the answer is, yes, I love what I'm doing, it's sustainable long term, then I would lean more towards the route of staying and enjoying the income, enjoying the light clinical schedule, being proud of what you've built, maybe getting some additional growth and riding that out for your career. Versus on the other side, if it's not sustainable, then that's where you have the conversation with the DSO. Like maybe you sell to the DSO and you transition yourself, into the next chapter. And so I think that there's a real interesting conversation to be had there that I don't think is such a straightforward answer.
Well, and there's two parts of this that I see as super interesting, which lean us to really seriously have this conversation. When we talk about a single doctor practice owner potentially selling to a DSO or not, they have options of I could sell private sale, I could hang on to this and practice here. There is less buyers and less options once you have a practice that size. And if the practice doesn't depend on you clinically, you have even more options when you're having these conversations with DSOs. And so that is where it gets really interesting of what, I could just, I know of a dentist who his whole platform is he lives in Costa Rica and he owns a large mega group in a somewhere else, and he doesn't have to run it, as a quarterly meeting. You can just own this asset and keep that income. You could sell it to a DSO. And this is the position where that conversation gets really interesting. And I know from what we were talking about, this wealth stagnation, we've hit this point really hard because it's leading into, I'm like, oh, I know where George is going.
Yeah, so you know where I'm going. So
I know where you're going.
Let's simulate the DSO sale, because there's an important piece that people need to understand about how DSOs operate. Is this, where I'm going with this? Is that where you thought? Yeah. So you have $5 to $8 million, right? Let's call it 6 to make it, fair. So what a DSO is going to do is they're going to say, okay, your equity in your practice is worth $6 million. We would like to acquire it. And there's a percentage of that you will get cash on close. And there's a percentage of that will be stock in the company that you will own a portion of the DSO, right? So let's just say in this example, $3 million cash on close, $3 million in stock. The only reason I'm saying this is because there's a core difference that platforms have that single locations don't, which is a platform's core method of growth is through expanding the number of locations that are a part of that platform. And so that, where you were with the wealth stagnation at the single practice, you are able to re-enter a phase of wealth accumulation by reinvesting your equity into a platform that's expanding the number of locations it has. So in simple terms, if I were to invest $3 million with a platform that has 50 locations and remain and keep that on board, then I would have, the $3 million to invest, but then I'd also have a $3 million invested in the platform. If that platform goes from 50 locations to 100 locations, then theoretically speaking, your equity should double in value, right? And so that's what gets people over the fence on at times. That's where DSOs have a unique advantage that private practice doesn't have, which is your wealth at the private practice is constrained within the four walls of your singular location. And in this situation, if the mega group owner were to sell it to the DSO, they would have the $3 million in cash that they can invest and grow their wealth that way. And then they would also have the $3 million in equity in the DSO that they could invest with the DSO. And as the DSO grows its number of locations, that $3 million will grow as well. And so essentially what you're doing is you're trading that income for wealth accumulation, both through the investing of the money you take off the table in the cash on close, and also the conversion of practice equity into DSO equity that typically grows at a faster pace because it's not constrained by a four walls that your private practice was. So that's the value proposition that DSOs have to offer in the marketplace, and it's very disruptive because it fundamentally changes things in a way that makes dentists have to reevaluate how they make decisions on wealth because they're able to offer something that's unique. And, that's how we've cut our teeth, on our side is by we've helped our doctors understand the value of platform ownership. And I think that that's where, there's many different options, and I think that they all come with different pros and cons. And I'm not so quick to have a strong judgment on one or the other. I really think each situation needs to be evaluated on its own, and the doctor owner needs to evaluate how sustainable it is. They need to evaluate how much wealth are they accumulating. They want to evaluate their desires, and then they go from there, right? I think that it's just not a one-size-fits-all type answer.
Yeah. I love that. And like I said, I think it's really fun to talk about this on the back end of coaching with shared practices for 3 to 4 years because it's a different scenario than a lot of dentists face.
Yeah.
And here's the, if you can't help but keep wanting to grow, say that you're like, you know what, this was kind of fun, and selling it and walking away, allows us to move, allows us to do different things, allows us to take a break. The way that you could continue to leverage this skill set that you have for the rest of your career, say that you have the skill set to take an office from under $1 million to $4 to $5 million in 4 years. And you do that, remove yourself clinically, sell to a DSO. You've got some invested in the DSO, you've got some cash on hand, and you've learned a whole ton. You know how this works, and you would do it differently. You would buy differently the next time, or if you started, you would start differently. You would set your lifestyle and your relationship to the practice up differently. You would set different expectations for associate doctors, having kind of lived through a whole life cycle of all of this, and you could probably do it faster and better. And so if someone was like, you know what, this is the best skill set I have to build wealth, and they're crazy enough to keep doing this, you could do this 4 or 5 times in a career. And this is that $20 to $30 million dentist that, gets sarcastically posted about in the dental investment group of people are like, oh, is this real? This anonymous poster, blah, 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 blah. That's a possibility if you go about it that way. And you don't have to. The thing that I love about that concept, you're accelerating in multiple ways without taking on multi-practice risk. And so you're getting faster and better at this, and you're putting your money in better and better places. And you're staying within this core lane of building, and you give yourself the chance to take a sabbatical between every practice. You could take 6 months to a year to 2 years, do whatever the heck you want, travel, and then do it again. So anyways, this is my little hypothesis, but I want people to see if they have this skill set to build and exit and invest in a DSO, in other things. The world is their oyster.
Yeah, and I think that, one type of dentist I'm very drawn to is the type of dentist that really likes the process of growth. I find that to be very relatable. And like, I really enjoy the process of growth. And I think that there's some dentists, like I was this one individual I'm thinking of, he'll know who he is when he hears this. He's 55 and has 5 offices and wants to put down the handpiece at some point clinically, but then wants to continue to grow the business as an entrepreneur. And I asked him, like, that's interesting. I like that, but why? And he's like, I just really love, the game of it and the process of growing and adding locations, opening up a new one, watching it grow, like all of these things. And I can really relate to that, and I think that, for the right dentist, if you like the process of growth, then continue to stay in the game. And if you're the other type of dentist where you're like, the problems mount, the stress builds, like, I don't like this as much, it's not as fun, and like, that's very real, different people, different desires, then like, less so. But I do think, to what Richard's saying, having the skill of knowing how to grow dental practices and knowing how to have like our very consistent hygiene approach to grow any office, can be leveraged over a whole career. And, so I think it's just the world is your oyster is a really, really great way of saying that, I think to each person is their own. They have various levels of ambition, appetite, and all of those things. And like, it's a very large industry where there's lots of opportunity and you can have as much or as little of it as you'd like.
And also realistically, here's what the arc is for that person. If they do decide to sell, they then go and try and do something else for 2 years, and they're like, crap, like, yeah, I can't beat what I can do in dentistry, and they come back, which is very, very common of like, ugh, I just know what I'm doing over here, and the opportunity is so good, and my risk and my knowledge base, which is what you were talking about earlier, in other areas is never as deep, and the barriers to entry in dentistry and knowing what you know after you've grown something, you kind of can't get rid of that knowledge.
Totally. Yeah, very well said. And I want to bring this back. I think we've kind of ended at a very high level, and I want to bring it back to, what we talked about at the beginning, which is, like, you're in your career. If you're listening to this, think about, what stage of my career am I at? Am I at the beginning of my career? If so, then the first step is what we talked about, the high income. Get that income going. And the income needs to be high enough so that you have your dentist lifestyle paid for, you've paid your taxes, and you're putting away whatever money you are desiring to put away into various investments. That's like step one of a dentist's career, is to put themselves in that situation sooner rather than later. And then the next stage is, hopefully in that situation you've put yourself in with the high income, there's a wealth accumulation component to it, right? And accumulate wealth in that. And then for private practice, there is the natural step of wealth stagnation that begins to occur. After you've accumulated the wealth that's available to you, be aware of the fact that you've entered into a wealth stagnation part of your career, and then ask yourself the question, what do I want to do then? And evaluate from there. If you're the type of person that Richard's describing, you want to keep growing, then you're essentially going to extend your wealth accumulation to be as long a part of your career as possible. If you're like, no, I'm good with the wealth stagnation, then you ride out the high income for more years, invest it, enjoy your life, and then, figure out you're capitalizing on your nest egg and exiting. But I think that generally that's been the kind of arc that we've been trying to describe throughout the whole episode. So I just wanted to kind of put that together for people so they didn't get lost in, where we were in the conversation, and think about this whole episode as like a cohesive story.
Well, and this is, I also just had another little epiphany, and I'm not, like, sometimes our listeners, I feel like they think like, oh, okay, well, they're just plugging this, they're just plugging that. But I just had the epiphany of like, oh, SPG doctors get access to a high income, and they get to go straight to kind of platform
ownership
opportunities early in their career, plus early in a DSO life cycle, where, you hear about MB2 doctors that were in the first turn or in the first, round of opportunity and have just held. They've just hung on, and the opportunities that are created there. So anyways, this conversation like also put into light where some of those early opportunities for people, if they're willing to have a long-term perspective, are pretty amazing, and you can have your cake and eat it too.
Well, and that's what I was talking about earlier with DSOs have disrupted this, because what DSOs have disrupted is they've offered wealth accumulation that doesn't really change. Yeah, it's that transition. Like a DSO doesn't go from wealth accumulation to wealth stagnation. Like the whole business model is like just accumulate, and get bigger and bigger. And so it's like that does have a very disruptive nature for what it means for the dentists. And I think that we came from the private practice world in legacy shared practices. And we are like, okay, well, how can we offer a different / better opportunity? And it's have a high income, have wealth accumulation, be faster and longer. And, at a core, that's kind of what we offer. And, but I'm not here to really propose or like support that or like, advocate for that. And like I think that it's just, I just want everyone to understand how much more complex these questions are now that there are many viable options. Before there was one viable option, private practice. And now there are multiple viable options. And so in order to evaluate those, we need to boil it down to income, savings, net worth through your career. And like, I think that I honestly think we've done that quite well in this episode.
And then the last factor, which we can't touch today, is the sustainability, like the sanity, the enjoyability. How much do you enjoy doing this versus you're trying to get somewhere and using this as a vehicle to get there? So that's the piece that we can never evaluate on behalf of someone else.
Totally agree.
Well, perfect. This was such a fun, high-level conversation, different than other conversations we've had on the podcast in the past about DSO opportunities and things like that. So, George, as always, thank you.
Yeah, thanks for having me on, Richard, and looking forward to the next episode of Ask George.